Adding a shadow or highlight on your characters in your scene can make them seem more three-dimensional and add a professional look to your animations. But what's the best way to add them? Well, there's quite a few ways in OpenToonz, and that's what we'll look at today. Hello friends, and welcome to today's video, where I'll go through quite a few ways to add shadows or highlights to your drawings. And as this video is quite long, and each technique will be useful in different situations, not just for shadows, you might want to refer back to it in the future. And to help, I've added links in the description to each different technique so you can jump straight to the section you're interested in. And as always, if you're new here, my name's Darren, and on this channel I have OpenToonz tutorials, news videos, collaborations and animations, so subscribe to not miss them and hit that bell to be notified when I release a new video. And if you're interested in animating with OpenToonz, check out the other videos on my channel, including plenty of beginner guides. And this is a video I've wanted to make for a couple of months, which was why I originally drew the Leela drawing and then animated it to give me a backdrop to paint shadows onto. And as with most things in OpenToonz, there's lots of ways to add shadows, and I'll share just a few of them today. And I think you'll find some of the techniques today will be useful not just for adding shadows, but for painting and managing other areas of your animation. And thanks to all the different users that have already shared their techniques with the community, some of which I'll be highlighting today. And if you use another technique, then why not tell us all about them in the comments below? I'd love to hear them. And so, without further ado, on with the show. So first, let's just consider the colour of shadows. Now you can just copy a colour and then change it for the shadow, or highlight for that matter, making it darker for shadows and lighter for highlights, and then paint with it. And I like to use the saturation and value sliders to change the colour rather than picking new colours from the wheel. And you can paint on the same level, or as I'll go into more detail later, paint on another level in another column to sit in front of your drawing. And painting in another column gives you the added benefit of being able to more easily erase any mistakes you make without erasing the original drawing. But it also means you can change the opacity using the alpha channel. And this makes the colour less opaque, letting the colours of the levels behind it show through. And you can use this to just pick black for shadows and white for highlights, and then reduce the opacity to the level of the shadow you need. But you can also choose a colour and it'll mix them, so this is a good way to apply the colour from a nearby light source to the character. And you can do this for each individual palette entry to add different colours to different parts of your drawing. And you can even animate these colours, but I'll cover that in another video. But if you've got a number of colours on a level and you want to apply an opacity change to them all, you can also do this by changing the opacity of the whole column. So if I change the opacity back to full, and then click the drop down, and you can change the opacity for the column by changing the slider down here. And you may also want to apply a colour filter over all the palette entries with the colour selector drop down here. And changing the opacity of a column is also good for other uses, like changing the opacity of a sketch column to reduce the visibility of your sketched lines as you ink on a separate column. But doing this only affects the colour and opacity temporarily while drawing and doesn't export this into the final render. To do that, you have to tick a box on the scene settings. So go to X Sheet, Scene Settings, and then tick the box at the bottom, Enable Column Colour Filter and Transparency for rendering. And now when you export your animation, it'll use the colour filter and column transparency levels. But these levels are fixed for the entire length of your animation. So if you want to change the transparency level, you can either change the colours individually on the palette, that I'll show you another time, or you could use the transparency effect on the column. So if I reset the transparency on the column here, back to 100%, and then take away the colour filter, and to add transparency, we go to the schematic. So I've got the stage schematic in a separate room here, and if I just rename the shadows level, and that'll make it easier to see. So if I press the little button at the bottom right of the schematic, that changes to the FX schematic. And then if I move some of these levels out of the way. So here we've got the raster drawing level, and here we've got the shadows drawing level. So we can just right click on the shadows level, choose Insert FX, then go to Layer Blending and down to transparency. And then double click the transparency node and you can set the intensity of the transparency in there. But to see this you have to turn on the preview mode. So that's this little eyeball button at the top right. So that's 50% transparency, and you just adjust it to the transparency level that you want. And if you want this to change throughout your animation, you just move to the appropriate frame and then press the key button. But I won't demonstrate that today, as the video is already quite long. But if you need that demonstrating, drop me a comment below, maybe I'll put out a video in the future for it. So there's the first few choices for changing the colour of your shadows, and you can use these for all level types. But speaking of which, let's take a look at each of the 3 level types in turn and their specific options for adding shadows. So you can add shadows on vector levels, but the filling of vectors can be tricky, so I'm using vectors less and less these days. But if you want to add shadows to a vector level, don't forget that you can use a separate raster or Toonz raster level on another column, and use any of the other techniques that I describe in this video in combination with your vector level. But if you want to add your shadow on the same layer, you can simply draw your shadow shape with the darker shadow colour and fill it in. But it's easy for these hand-drawn shapes to not fill properly. So as I showed in an earlier video, you can add another shape, filled in the shadow colour, and resize it to cover where you'd like the shadow. Let me show you what I mean. So I'd add a geometric shape. A rectangle is just fine. I'll select for it to auto group, and that means that this shape will float above any other drawings in this level. So let's just draw a rectangle on screen. Now I'm going to add the shadow to the hair, so what I need to do is to add a shadow colour darker than the hair colour. So I'll base it on the hair colour by right clicking and choosing copy on the hair and then pasting it. Now simply make this slightly darker, fill in the rectangle. I'll then use the select tool to select the rectangle, and by selecting colour 0 that removes the outline from the rectangle. And then using the control point editor over here, I can select on the rectangle and then move the points of the shadow to wherever I need them to be, and I can click and drag on the outside line of it to add a curve, adjust it with these handles, and if I want to add a new control point I can hold the control key and click on the line, or if I press and hold on a control point I can tap the delete key and it disappears. So I can just adjust this line to where I want the shadow to go. Then when you click away, there's the shadow. And this might not be the easiest way to add shadows, but it does mean that your shadow has the same vector property of being able to be shown at any size and not look pixelated. So my preference these days is to work on Toonz raster levels. They're just so much more flexible, and compared to vector levels, the fills just work. So the easiest way to add a shadow is to just paint them on using the paintbrush tool. So you can just create a darker shadow colour for each of the colours in the palette. By right clicking, choosing copy and then hidden paste. And then adjusting the saturation or the value until you get the right colour. So you can use the paintbrush tool to paint the shadow in. And that paints in the fill style, which is useful as I've mentioned in previous videos, so that you can tell the difference between lines and area fills when you use the eraser, fill tools and some of the effects. But it's really easy to go over the lines, which isn't too bad on the outside of a character. So if I deliberately go over the outside of the line here, when you choose the erase tool, you can choose to erase only areas and not lines, so it won't delete any of this black line, so you can go up to and over the black line and it'll only remove the purple shadow area. But internally, over multiple colours, if you go over the edge, you can't easily erase the purple that I've painted over the skin of the character, you'll have to paint over in the skin colour. But the easier way to do this is just to paint the shadows on a different layer. So if I undo all of those shadows, and then create a new layer, and again you can reduce the alpha to choose the exact darkness of your shadow, but now because I'm on a separate layer I can just use the erase tool and just erase where I don't want the shadows a lot easier without worrying about the colours. And another thing you can do that might be useful in some circumstances to prevent painting over the lines is simply to clone a level by selecting all of the frames, choosing cells and then clone. That'll create you a copy. You can then make all the colours on the cloned level black and then erase parts of this silhouetted drawing to reveal the colours on the main level. So for instance, on the cloned level, if I change the hair colour to be black, the skin colour to be black, eyes to be black, etc. And now I choose the erase tool, I'll make it larger. And now as you erase, you reveal the colours of the drawing underneath. And then you just change the alpha using one of the three ways that I discussed earlier, by changing the individual alpha level for each of the colours, by using the column's transparency slider, which is probably the preferred way, or adding a transparency effect. Now raster levels don't retain any detail of how the ink got to the page, so there's no knowledge or history of which geometry tools you've used, which strokes you've laid down, nor have any linkage between the colours on the page and the palette entry. Once the paint's on the page, it's just that, paint on the page. So you can't use a lot of the techniques from earlier, but you can still add shadows. So you can just paint darker colours where you want shadows, by choosing the current colour, making it darker, and then choosing the standard brush tool and painting. But it's really easy to go over the lines and you can't easily erase them. But as I've mentioned before, you can paint your shadows on another column, so that means that you can erase the shadows without erasing the main painting. Plus you can still use two of the three alpha techniques I mentioned at the start. You can set the column's alpha level or add a transparency effect to the shadow column, but you can't change the alpha of the colour. But there is a unique feature available only to raster levels that's worth knowing about, and that's to use an alpha setting in the My Paint brushes. So to use that, all you need to do is choose a My Paint brush from the raster list. So I'll choose this one here, go to the settings tab, and at the very bottom you've got this option called Lock Alpha. When it's set to 0, it means that as you paint, the colour can go anywhere. But if you move it all the way to the top, it means that the paint will only be applied where you've got paint already on the page. And this means as you add shadows, you can't go outside of the lines. And this is really useful for adding shadows, but will also be useful for lots of other effects. So for instance, if you bring it down, so it's midway between fully on and fully off, as you paint across your drawing, this helps to specify how much colour will be overlaid onto where there's already ink and how much will be applied to where there isn't any paint. So if I move it near to the top, as I paint, very little ink appears on the outside, but more appears where there is already some paint on the page. But generally you want the setting to be all the way down to 0, which means the paint will apply equally everywhere, or all the way to the top, which means the paint will only be applied where you've already got paint. And even though we have My Paint brushes on Toonz raster levels, this setting doesn't yet work with those, as the Toonz raster levels don't use any of the blend or erase options of the My Paint brushes, but hopefully one day they will. And within all three level types, I've got 4 ways to keep your shadows inside the lines. Firstly, there's 2 types of effects you can add, and these involve adding an extra column for your shadows, as effects work on all drawings in a specific column. So first, let's add a new level in a new column, and I choose a Toonz raster level, but it could be any of the 3 types. And now painting some quick shadows, not really being concerned about going outside the lines. Okay, so now I'll show the schematic view, and I've already got this docked in this room here for my schematic and effects. So here's the schematic shown in the FX mode first off. If it's not shown in the FX mode, there's a button at the bottom right. You can click that to change between the stage schematic and the FX schematic. But it is the FX schematic that we need. So we just need the 2 levels showing, so that's the Toonz raster level and the new shadows level. So there's 2 main effects we can choose from, and there's probably more inside the effects list, but these are the main 2 that I use. So the first one is called Matte In. So to apply the effect, you can right click on either of the nodes or just on the table, it doesn't really matter, and choose Add Effects. From the matte list, choose Matte In. So you've got two inputs for this effect, you've got the source and the matte. And we're using this effect to choose which of the shadows are shown, so the shadow node will be the source. So we'll click from the blue triangle for the output of the shadow node and drag over to the source input of the Matte In effect node. And this effect needs to know where it can draw the shadows, and where it can draw them is over the Toonz raster column of where there's any paint. So you simply drag again from the output of the Toonz raster to the matte input of the Matte In effect. So the shadow is the source to be drawn, and the Toonz raster level is the background to use as a matte. And then you simply connect that node from the output to the input of the X sheet. And because we want the whole of the Toonz raster level drawn as well as being used as a matte, we click and drag from the output of the Toonz raster into the X sheet. So if this is your first time looking at the effects, this can be quite confusing, so you might need to rewatch this a few times. But basically, we're showing all of the Toonz raster level by connecting it to the X sheet. We're using the Toonz raster level as a matte, which basically states where the shadows will be drawn using this effect, and then the shadows are just the source to be drawn over that matte, with the output going to the X sheet. And nothing's changed in the view so far, and that's because to see the effect of any FX node, you have to turn on the preview option. And that's this button shaped like an eyeball at the top right of the drawing panel. So if you click that, and it'll constrain the drawing of the shadow to the drawing in the Toonz raster column. So to make this easier to see, if I go to the shadows column and I change the alpha of the shadow colour, so it better matches what a shadow would look like, you notice the screen clears and then redraws, and that's because we're in render mode, so that's to calculate and redraw the whole screen. And using the effects nodes and the render mode does slow down the screen, so once you're happy with the effect, just click the button to turn off the preview mode. And by doing that, you can see where the shadow goes outside the lines of the main drawing. So if I turn the preview on and off a couple of times, you can see what it's done. So if I zoom back out, so you can see all the shadows, and that looks much better. Now you might remember that I said earlier there's two effects that do this clipping, and the other one is the multiply node. So let me just show you how that one works. I'll turn off the preview first. So if you right click, add effect, and then go down to layer blending INO, and from this list choose multiply INO. And again, there's two inputs for a foreground and a background. So to remove the old effect, you can simply right click and choose delete. And then as before, the shadows are now the foreground. And it adds that connection to the node, but also leaves the previous connection to the X sheet, which we don't want. So you click and drag over that line and it'll turn blue, then tap the delete key, and that'll remove that connection. And the Toonz raster level should be used as a background for this. And again, you connect the node to the X sheet. Now there's one more thing to do, so double click on the node and we get a pop-up, and just make sure that the clipping mask option is ticked. So if I turn on the preview mode, again the shadow is clipped to the edge of the drawing. Now there's one more feature of using this multiply node, and that's we've got an opacity option automatically built into the node. So on the shadows layer earlier, where I changed the alpha down to 75, so the shadows weren't dark, if I move that back up to full opacity, and then right click on the drawing area and choose regenerate preview, then it regenerates that colour having full alpha, and now we can use the opacity on the effect to change the brightness or darkness of the foreground column. So with this effect, you get two settings in one, clipping to the drawing and changing the opacity. And as I said, using any of these two effects requires the preview to be turned on to see the outcome, so you can't see the effect running with preview turned off, but I've got another tip for that in a few minutes. But what if you want to stop your paint going over parts of the inside of the image? Well, that's what this final effect can help with. So the final effect I'd like to show you is a way to match your shadows, or whatever you draw in this new level, onto specific colours of your drawing. So this allows you to add a shadow over your character's skin and clothes, for instance, but not their hat. Or, in this case, over Leela's face, but not on her hair. And this one will get a bit complicated, so you might need to watch through this a few times, but I'll try and make this as clear as I can. So for the main drawing, we need to be able to identify specific colours in the palette. So this has to be drawn in a vector or Toonz raster level. So I use my Toonz raster level. So as it is for my previous two effects, I'll add another level on another column. And as with the other effects, we can use any level type for the shadow, but I'll choose a Toonz raster. And I'll just paint some quick shadows over the face, not worrying about going over the lines into the hair. And as before, I've changed the alpha for these shadows. And here you can see clearly I've gone over the lines into the hair. And also for a giggle, I've gone over the outside of the head, just so you can see how this works. So to add this effect, you go to the FX schematic, and that's available from the Windows menu under Schematic. And you might find that you're in the view of the stage schematic here at the top left, so just press the button at the bottom right to change between stage schematic and the FX schematic. So I'll just rename the shadows level so we can see it clearer in the FX schematic. So we need to add two effects for this to work. We need a palette filter first, so you right click anywhere on the background of the schematic and go to Add Effects, Toonz Level, Palette Filter. I will also add a matte effect, so Add Effects, Matte, Matte In. So the idea of this is that the Toonz raster level goes into the palette filter. This just selects the skin colour and allows whatever drawing is drawn in the skin colour to come out of the end of the node. That will then go into the matte effect as the matte, and that will state where the shadows are allowed to be drawn on. And then the shadows are the source for that matte, so that says what will be drawn over the matte. So let's just reorder these nodes. And then the Toonz raster level is also plugged straight into the X sheet because we do want the rest of this Toonz raster level to be visible. But the easiest way to set this up is to remove the Toonz raster level from the X sheet by clicking and dragging on the background of the schematic till you cross that line. It'll turn blue and then you can press the delete key. Plug in the matte effect to the X sheet so that will be visible, so whatever comes through this route will be visible. So what we need to do is find the index colour for the skin palette entry, and the best way to do this is to remove the output of the shadows, the output of the Toonz raster level, and just put the palette output into the X sheet. This means you can only see which parts of the Toonz raster level are being filtered through the palette filter and then go to the X sheet. So if you double click the palette filter, you'll see that at the minute colour indexes 1, 2 and 3, which is the background, the black and the blue for lines and areas, are being deleted, which is why you can't see the black outline around Leela. So what we need to do is lines and areas is correct. The action we want to have is to keep only the colours we choose, and if I change the size so we can see enough of the drawing, it'll make it easier. And we need to find the colour index for the skin. So the best way to do this is to guess a number and type it into the colour index text box, click away and see what appears on screen. So I'll go through these numbers to find the index for the skin colour. There we go, so the colour index is 29. Now depending exactly how you painted your shadows, this could be a laborious way to find the colour. And you might prefer, instead of keeping index number 29, is to delete a different colour. So for this shadow I've painted, you might choose to delete the hair colour from the output. And I hope this makes some sense. It's quite difficult to explain, and perhaps when you use this effect yourself with your drawings, it might make more sense. So in summary, the palette filters enable me to select where I've painted with the skin colour and remove all of the rest of the colours. And what I can do then is to use that as the matte for the shadows. So if I then connect that to the matte in, with the source being the shadows, and then connect the node for the matte in to the X sheet, the shadows only appear where the skin colour was painted. So if we now connect the Toonz raster level to the X sheet, then that draws the rest of the Toonz raster level. So if I zoom in again, you can see the shadow is only painted over the skin colour. If I turn off the preview mode, you'll see where it goes outside the lines of the main area, and over the hair colour, and into the eye colour. So if I turn on preview again, you see the shadow is constrained to only where the skin is. So hopefully, although it's quite hard to explain, you can see the power behind the palette filter effect. And you wouldn't want to add shadows to each area on a different column, but it could be a useful way to restrict your painting to one particular area of your drawings. And finally, there's a little trick that I saw Dave from Blended Planet using. And I've got a link to his channel in the description below, so take a look at that, as he's putting together an anime using OpenToonz, Blender and Krita. And you can watch his process of putting it together, and it's well worth a look. So the tip he gave out was to use the plastic tool mesh as a way to keep your shadow within the outline of your character. So to do this, you simply add a plastic mesh to the character by choosing the plastic tool. That's here on the left hand side. Make sure you select it on the drawing you want to add the mesh to. Hit create mesh. Make the size of the mesh small enough to fit the curves of the shape of your character, but not so small that it will take a long time to render. So try and get them as large as you dare, but still allowing each mesh shape to follow the size and shape of your character. And this is something you just need to experiment with. You can change your mind later once you've put this together, so don't get too hung up on it straight away. So make sure the mesh margin is as small as possible, and I think 2 is the minimum, so we'll change that down to 2. And if you make it any larger, you see the mesh go outside the outside of your character a long way. So you want this as small as you can get it. So we'll pop it down to 2 and just hit apply. And because I've already created a mesh earlier, it's asking me the question what to do with that mesh. I'll delete the old level, that's fine. So it adds a mesh column in front of your main drawing, and you want to extend this for as long as your animation lasts. So if there's different drawings for animation, you'll need to create a new mesh for each drawing, but I won't go into that today. So to make this work, the first thing you need to do is to add a root node for the skeleton. So just click anywhere in your drawing. So that's enough for that. Then you need to add your shadow into a new column. So again, I create a Toonz raster level, extend that for as long as the animation, and I'll paint a shadow over the character, not worrying about going outside the lines. So that'll do for now. And I'll just drop the alpha down to give it the right sort of colour, and then make any adjustments to the shadow. Good. So all we need to do is to bring up the schematic view, and in the stage schematic I'll just adjust these nodes here. So we've got the mesh column, and hanging off that is the Toonz raster level. And to make this work, all you need to do is to connect the shadow to the output of the mesh, and immediately the shadow drawing is constrained to the mesh outline. And to stop the mesh messing with your main drawing, you can just remove it from the mesh now it's created, and your shadow will be the only thing constrained to it. So just click and drag along the line that connects the 2 nodes from the Toonz raster level to the mesh, and then hit the delete key, and the Toonz raster level is automatically connected back to the table, so the mesh no longer affects it, but the shadow is still constrained by the mesh outline. And once it's created, don't forget that you can edit the mesh to fix any small issues. So let's just zoom into the head, and if you go to the plastic tool, you can change the mode to edit mesh, select on the cell in the mesh column, and then as you hover over the mesh, the vertexes are highlighted, and you click and drag and you can move them to wherever you need them to go. So you can bring the shadow closer to the character, and if you go back to animate mode, you can now see that shadow is better constrained to the character. And now the mesh is set up, you can turn it off in the view by clicking the camera stand visibility button, or you can move the column behind the main drawing so you can't see it. But I like to turn it off. So the benefit of using the plastic mesh technique is that you don't need to use the preview option to see the effect in action. However, the downside is that you'll need to create a new mesh for each frame of animation, so it isn't ideal for lots of action, but could be useful for a simple character movement. So there's quite a few ways to add shadows and highlights to your animations, and I know I've not covered all of them here, so if you have another technique you like to use, why not share it with the rest of us in the comments below. So, adding shadows, plenty of options to do so. So why not give some of these techniques a try, and see if they can help you create more interesting animations? I bet they will. And that's a guarantee.